Hi, I am David Veitch, and I am also a second-year PhD student. And also, I'm going to explain my PhD research, which is looking at methods of measuring ventilation rates in occupied houses. So my presentation is going to give a bit of background about why we might want to know about ventilation, and some of the techniques you can use to measure ventilation, and then moving on to the technique I'm focusing my research on. So as Carrie talked about earlier, ventilation in buildings is important for a number of reasons. People often think it's to provide oxygen for respiration so we can all breathe, but in reality that's a very tiny proportion. So in reality there's two main reasons for ventilation. The first off is to provide a good indoor air quality by diluting the pollutants that are produced inside buildings. In a domestic scenario, these are normally water vapor from cooking, cleaning, washing, etc. VOCs, the chemicals from new carpets, paints, things like that. Body odor from yourself or maybe your pets, which just isn't very nice. And the last one is nitrogen oxides, which are released from cooking quite often. And most of these have been linked to health impacts on the occupants. The second main purpose of ventilation is to provide thermal comfort, especially in the summer months, as here in the UK. Ventilation is really the only way we have to keep our buildings cool, as domestic air conditioning isn't very prevalent. So this graph shows what kinds of levels of ventilation are required for some of these. And as you can see, to provide oxygen is on the very bottom of that graph, so I don't think it's possible we can seal the building up tight enough to cause a problem in that aspect. So ventilation, the dominant use of ventilation in domestic properties is actually to minimize moisture buildup. So given that ventilation is important, the problem is whenever we go to the heating season, bringing in the cool external air adds significantly to the space heating load, and it's estimated to be about 20% across the UK housing stock. But whenever you start to look at modern, well-insulated dwellings, this rises to over 30%. And this air that comes in consists of two portions, the controlled ventilation through the windows, trickle vents, etc. But then also the continuous background infiltration, and that comes in through the gaps. So in order to save energy, the mantra has been for quite a while to seal tight and ventilate right, you may have heard. And the idea is, for that is to remove the continuous background infiltration and bring it all into the realm of occupant control. But the risk we run with that is that if these systems that we have to ventilate, if they don't operate as anticipated, then we run the risk of causing problems in terms of occupant health and comfort. So how do our buildings actually perform? Looking at the literature, there really isn't that much information on studies that have been carried out. A sort of review paper that was published last year looked at the studies across Europe for the last 20 years. I think it estimated there was about 4,000 dwellings had been looked at, which sounds quite a lot, but I think there's something like 200 million dwellings in Europe, so it's pretty small. And what the general findings are that in reality, the ventilation rate is significantly below what's been required under building regulations for quite some time. And this even carries forward to relatively new buildings, or new dwellings that have been monitored. But whilst there's a general failure to provide the rate, there's also a very long tail to the distribution. So some properties that are envisaged to have the same ventilation rate are maybe a factor over what we expect them to be. So in terms of trying to close this gap and deliver ventilation systems that are robust for occupant use, but also at the same time save energy, we really need to build some better understanding of what's actually happening in dwellings as they're used day to day. The reason that there's not that much in the literature is that the sort of techniques we have to measure ventilation haven't really seen much development in the last 15 or 20 years. And that really makes them very inhibitive. So that brings me on to the sort of problem statement for my research, is that how can we sort of use alternate techniques or bring to bear advancements in technologies and equipment onto this problem whilst remaining or giving a monitoring scheme that's cost-effective, robust, and hopefully non-intrusive. And so the approach for my research, as with everything, starts with a literature review. So looking at what ways we can measure ventilation and what equipment we can use for this, and trying to find a synergy between the two, and taking sort of techniques from this space forward to do some initial theoretical modeling, then moving on to controlled testing in sort of test cells, and hopefully onto dwelling case studies at the end of the work. as I'm in my second year, I'm sort of hovering around the middle stage, so I'm doing some controlled testing at the moment, so I'm briefly going to talk about each of these stages. So when it comes to measuring ventilation, the only way to give an accurate estimate of the total ventilation coming into a space is to use tracer gases. Some other techniques using blower doors or pressurization tests or flow hoods over terminals, they only really give a snapshot of what's going on, whereas we're really interested in the long-term performance under the occupant's control. So in terms of tracer gas, the basic premise of how these work is pretty simple. You just add some kind of tracer to the air inside the building, and then you monitor its concentration, which is inversely proportional to the ventilation rate. So again, looking through the literature, there's sort of three main methods that have been used, sort of going up in complexity from concentration decay, moving up to constant injection, constant concentration, which I don't really have time to talk about. But there's one that I found that sort of uses system identification approaches taken from sort of industrial control system design. And this is one that I thought could bring some benefit to the area, which I will now attempt to explain on this slide. It hasn't really worked before in terms of my explanation, but I'm going to try. So you have a system, in this case it's a building, with ventilation between each of the different parts of the building and also to the outside. And the way the technique works is you apply some kind of disturbance signal to the building. In this case, it's injecting pulses of tracer gas, and that results in an output in the system, which is fluctuations in the tracer gas concentration. And these fluctuations depend on the ventilation rate. So using cross-correlation between the input and output, you can generate what's called the impulse response of the system. And then by looking at these impulse responses, you can solve and determine the flow rates in the building. Comparing these to some of the existing techniques that are out there, the benefits of it are that by using signals that aren't correlated to each other, you can actually determine, for example, in this building, I've sort of shown it as 3 zones, you can actually determine all those 12 flow rates using a single tracer gas all at once. So other techniques to do multi-zone tests, you need multiple tracer gases. So this helps to simplify the equipment. Another benefit of it is that you can do it continuously, so it gives information on the variance of ventilation rates over time. Another one is that the tracer gas injection, you don't actually need to know how much gas you're putting in. You just need to keep it consistent in these pulses, which is another benefit over some of the more complex schemes that are out there at the minute. And also, because you're looking at disturbances in the tracer gas concentration that are correlated to the input, you can use potentially a tracer gas that is already present in the environment, for example, carbon dioxide. So that's the sort of literature review, and I've now selected this system identification approach to move forward. So I started doing some modeling in Matlab Simulink and building a sort of simple model of a multi-zone building. I've been using that to explore sort of a general proof of the method, the effects of sensor performance that you might use to implement it in terms of its accuracy, its noise, the speed of response, things like that, and how the technique responds to varying airflow rates, background sources of tracer gases, and the bugbear of all tracer gas techniques is that things are never homogeneous inside the building. What effect does that have? So the results have been encouraging, and I'm currently trying to write a paper to pull it all together, but it seems to work reasonably well as intended. And on the strength of that, I've been moving on to the physical testing. So I've built a 1 meter cube test cell in my spare bedroom to do some testing on using some bits and pieces I've put together from Arduino microcontrollers to control the gas and release it in the sequence required and sort of synchronize it across different parts. So that's going quite well. And these are the kind of sort of signals you get. I don't know, my arms aren't quite long enough to point up there, but I'll try anyway. But you can sort of see the repeating sequence you get, and then from that you can calculate the flow rate. So again, that's going quite well. I'm looking forward to, or trying to build a bigger test cell with multiple chambers, if I can find the space somewhere. So just to summarize, if this technique moves forward, what might it bring to the area? Well, hopefully it'll bring sort of enhanced results. So again, the temporal and spatial variation in ventilation, whilst doing that at a lower cost and complexity over current techniques. And also because it's electronic in the way that I've implemented, some of the other techniques require sort of lab-based processing at the end of the monitoring. So it allows, if you're doing a long-scale, a long-term study, you can sort of monitor the results as you go along. And then from this information, we can start to understand the distribution of the ventilation rates across different dwelling types and ventilation systems, seeing how robust they are. For example, do certain designs depend overly on wind direction or wind speed, things like that. Also, you can start to look at, as ventilation changes over time, you could potentially start to look at correlation of when do occupants take action on their ventilation. And again, that also applies to overheating as well. I think that's it. Thank you very much.